Recently I made a couple of desks as a commission for a client, and when I was delivering them to his home, he mentioned that he had some solid beech dining chairs that were in need of repair. There were 6 in total, but initially I just took 4 of them away, and in this video I'm going to show you how I repaired and refinished them. The main problem with these chairs, as you can see, is that the joints are loose, so the chairs had quite a lot of movement in them. When I lifted the seat pad out, I found that there was another problem. The corner brackets, which should be providing extra support to the chair frame, were really badly fitted. There were some big gaps. It looks like they just glued and screwed them without worrying about the gaps, and I think that's what caused these glue joints to fail. I wasn't sure how long it would take me to repair the chairs, so what I agreed with the client was that I'd repair one of the chairs, time how long that took, and then I could price up the job to repair all of the chairs based on that. And I'll talk more about how long the project took at the end of the video. I first took the chair into the workshop and I started to remove the corner brackets. Some of them needed a few taps with a mallet and there was a bit of grain tear out to deal with. Others came off easily because the glue joints had completely failed, so it was just the screws holding those in place. The dowel rails at the bottom of the chair still seemed quite solid, but these would have to come apart with the rest of the frame and be re-glued anyway. I used my mallet to break the mortice and tenon joints, and then I could wiggle each piece free. I reconfigured one of my clamps as a spreader clamp, and that helped to break some of the glue joints apart too. And I marked up each part of the chair to help me with putting everything back together later. With all of the parts disassembled, this is where I found some problems. Some of the mortises were cut really badly, like here where it looks like someone slipped with the router at the end of the cut. And here where I really don't know what happened, but the mortice was much longer than the tenon. I couldn't quite believe that whoever made these chairs left the joinery like this without either remaking the pieces or at least plugging the gaps with some wood. And I knew I'd need to find a way to sort this problem, which I'll get around to later on in the project. I found that putting the chair frame in the vise gave me a bit of extra leverage to be able to wiggle the dowels free. Then I started to clean off all of the old glue, and this was the trickiest and most time-consuming part of the job, because it was important to get all of the old glue off to get to bare wood so that the new glue would adhere properly to the wood, but I also needed to not scrape away too much of the wood because the joints would still need to be tight enough to get a good adhesion. I used a combination of tools for scraping the old glue away. Here I'm using an old chisel, and then I did some light sanding. To sand the inside of the mortises, I wrapped the sandpaper around a pencil. Again, I'm being careful here to remove the old glue but not sand away any of the wood. The backrest of the chair seemed really solid, so I decided to try to dismantle the bottom of the chair without taking that part apart. Using the spreader clamp again, I could spread apart the bottom of the chair, and I found that there was enough flex in the wood to allow me to take out the back rail and clean out the old glue from the mortises without disassembling the backrest rails. For the tenons at the end of the chair rails, I used a Stanley knife blade to remove the old glue. And then I used an old chisel to clean up the shoulders of the tenon joint. The end of the dowels also got scraped and sanded, and I used a narrow chisel to remove the glue from the mortises. After doing a quick dry fit to make sure that the pieces fitted together nicely, I could then apply fresh glue to the joints. And then I removed the spreader clamp. I added some F-clamps to clamp up the back of the chair. I wiped away excess glue squeezing from the joints with a damp cloth. Then I started to reassemble the front of the chair. And here you'll see I'm clamping the dowel in first, which wasn't really the best idea because the holes for the dowels had been drilled deeper than necessary, which meant that I had to back off the clamping pressure from the doweled part of the frame and concentrate the clamping pressure on the mortise and tenon rails instead. I used my speed square to check that everything was squared up, and I had to use a bit of mallet persuasion to get the corners at 90 degrees. Next I needed to start working on these badly cut mortises. For the mortise that had been cut too long, I decided I'd use some scrap wood to plug the gaps. I first offered up the tenon and made some pencil marks to indicate where I'd need to add some wood. I measured the mortise with my calipers and then went hunting for a piece of wood that I could use that was close to being the right size, and I found a piece of oak that I could use for this. I cut off a piece to length with my handsaw, and then by putting my hand plane into a vise I could refine the thickness of the piece. I had to be careful here to keep my fingers away from the sharp cutting edge. And after a few passes, the piece of oak fitted the mortise quite nicely. I then used my disc sander to round over the end just by eye so that it would fit inside the mortise nicely. I did a dry fit and I found I needed to take a bit more off the length, which I marked up and then shaped at the disc sander again. I could then glue it in place and it was a pretty good friction fit, but I did need to use a nail punch just to force the roundover in place. I then used a narrow chisel to carve out a concave arc for the tenon to fit. A gouge chisel would have been ideal for shaping this, but I didn't have one small enough. I kept offering up the tenon to make sure the shape was good. Next I needed to plug the other end of the mortise, and for that I shaped another piece and cut it to size at the bandsaw, and here I'm using a clamp to hold the workpiece to keep my fingers away from the blade. That got glued in place too, and held with a small clamp until the glue set. I could then add new glue, and this is how the joint looked once plugged. This joint should now be stronger than ever, as not only is there more wood to support the tenon, but the way that the plug was glued in would also offer extra gluing surface where the side grain of the tenon meets the side grain of the plug. I started assembling the rest of the chair frame. And then I could add the back of the chair, which I clamped up earlier, to the rest of the frame. Again, I used my speed square to make sure that everything was square, or at least close enough for the eye not to notice. One of the dowels must have had a void inside and some open grain because the glue oozed out of the sides. For the other bad mortise joint, rather than plugging the hole, I just mixed up some epoxy and added that once the chair frame was assembled. That will fill the gap and also provide extra glue strength to reinforce the joint. With the chair frame assembled, I could start working on the corner brackets. I first cleaned off the old glue and any grain tear out at the disc sander. Then I offered them up to the corners and used a pencil to mark up where material needed to be removed to get a perfect fit. And I did this with each bracket on each corner on all of the chairs. I added fresh glue, drilled new pilot holes, and then added some screws. The chairs had some wear and tear and dents on them, particularly on the legs,
and the finish was also quite dry in places. So I asked the client if he wanted me to give them a bit of a freshen up while I had them, and he said yes please. So I did a bit of sanding with some 120 grit to smooth everything over, and then applied some of my homemade oil wax finish, which by the way is available to buy online at my Etsy store. There's a link to that in the description box below. This rejuvenated the wood really nicely and made it nice and smooth to the touch. I used another clean cloth to remove any excess wax immediately after putting it on. As the chairs had been re-glued, the final thing I wanted to do was to place the chair on a flat surface, and I used my table saw for that to check for wobble. As you can see, this chair had maybe a couple of millimeters of wobble, so I held the chair legs that needed to be shortened up against the disc sander to take away some of the material until the chair sat on the flat surface with no wobble. For the legs that had been shortened slightly, I used my card scraper to add a slight bevel on the ends. This should stop the wood on the bottom of the legs tearing out when the chairs get dragged around. And then I applied some more wax. Eventually I got all 6 of the chairs repaired, and there were many more bad mortises to deal with too, like this one for example. But this one was quite easy. I filled the hole by adding some wood glue to a piece of 12mm dowel, and then I could trim it flush.
So I mentioned near the start of this video that I wasn't sure how long these chair repairs would take me, so I didn't know what to quote the client. When I repaired the first chair, it took about 3 hours, so I figured that if I worked on 2 or 3 chairs at the same time, I could probably repair 3 chairs in a day. So the price I quoted the client was my day rate divided by 3, and that was the cost per chair. So as there were 6 chairs, that worked out as 2 days work, and I think that worked out about right. It wasn't particularly enjoyable work, to be honest. Scraping old glue away is not a nice job, and that's what took most of the time with these repairs. But as I'm now doing this kind of work for 3 days a week, having recently dropped hours at my day job to 3 days a week too, this kind of work will help to pay the bills, and being in the shed doing this kind of thing with my music or a good podcast on, working for myself and with only my cat for company, suits me just fine, so I can't complain. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe if you haven't already for more weekly woodworking videos, and thank you for watching.